Hey y'all, welcome back. Today we're checking out the real foreign invasion of Britain.
We hear a lot these days that, Britain is being invaded.
It's an invasion. We are being invaded.
Britain is being invaded.
This was an invasion.
But I just want to quibble for a second, right? In order for a country to be invaded, it would require another country coming here and taking control of our resources, our assets, and our government. The media has very cleverly managed to distract us from the foreign powers that have actually come into this country and taken control. So today we're going to dive deep into the real foreign invasion of Britain.
The money laundering centre of the world is not actually New York, it's London.
The BBC has discovered evidence that a major Tory party donor was a director of a company secretly owned by a Russian oligarch close to President Putin.
You met with the former KGB officer Alexander Lebedev without officials on the 28th of April 2018.
I'd have to check this.
Whoa, y'all. We're getting serious today. Trying to keep it light. Might not be light. Be sure to go to Jimmy the Giant, like and subscribe. And also check out my other reaction channel, JJLA Reacts Music. Okay.
Got to see the thick masalas in Wetherspoons are quite good. The rice was all right. There was a couple little bits that were congealed.
That might not come as a surprise to you, but Brits, we love a curry. Fucking love it, mate. Like, it is the tikka masala is Britain's national dish. However, as much as we love the food, our relationship with India has been complicated.
The story of British involvement in India begins early in the 17th century. They worked for a private company, the East India Company.
All the way back in the 1600s, the British East India Tea Company was just that. It was a company, it was a business, and it came over to India and, got a small grant for a bit of land to do some business. Now, these boys were very successful, right? They were shot in teas and spices left, right, and centre, and they were making a lot of money, and so too were the very powerful rulers of India. And so these big citadels would pop up all around India, owned by the East Indian Tea Company. And everyone was having fun. Like, we were drinking the teas, we were doing the curries, it was great. And in all of that excitement, the East India Tea Company turned around and said, how about we make a private army? Was that? Yeah, don't worry, it's just to look after the tea. You see, the local rulers, right, they were drunk on this new money. They were loving it, so they didn't see any problems. However, in 1857, many people of India turned around and said, hang on a sec, did we just give our country to a fucking tea company?
It began with a mutiny, a full-scale uprising across the subcontinent, a violent rejection of British control, a rejection of the imposition of Britishness on the Indian way of life.
Indians were super pissed, they had a big rebellion, the Brits flattened them, and so it would be in 1858 where the East India Tea Company took control of the whole of India and handed it over to the British Empire.
What? I didn't know all that. I didn't know all that. I didn't know it started in the 1600s. I've heard of the East India Company before. An English and later British joint stock company that was founded in 1600 and dissolved in 1874 was formed to trade in the East Indian Ocean region, initially with the East Indies and later with East Asia. The company gained control of large parts of the Indian subcontinent and Hong Kong. At its peak, the company was the largest corporation in the world by various measures and had its own armed forces in the form of the company's 3 presidency armies, totaling about 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army at certain times. So it was a company. I mean, I've heard of it, but I guess I just thought it was like the name of the British organization in India. Well, I guess it was, but I thought it was more closely tied in with the British government. Wow. Okay.
Jump forward a bit, right? It's World War II now, and the British Empire is kind of coming to an end. We go back to a lot of these nations that we colonized and we give them their sovereignty back. But you see, it left Britain in a very unusual position. The Great British Empire, we ruled the world. And all of a sudden, we fell off. Like we were just a small island now. But worry not, my friends.
I wouldn't say
the British would not give up its empire so easily.
From the River Thames to London Wall, from Temple Bar to Aldgate Pump, a city, but 1 square mile.
All right, so within the city of London, there is a place called the City of London. This is a small region, a 2.9 miles squared area, which is a state within a state. They have their own rules, traditions, their own mayor. And so this area, right, it would become very relevant in this post-war period. You gotta think post-war, this is a period like pre-internet. This was like pre-RuneScape. We're talking letters and fucking messenger pigeons. Now imagine in this time, right, you're like a big business boy. And like you loved doing the business, right? You loved it. But the business that you really wanted to get your hands on was that, you know, that sort of blood money. You know, nothing gets the boys going, like a bit of death. And like there were lots of places where you could get a hold of this kind of money, and they were in these resource-rich nations such as Nicaragua, Peru, Ghana, Colombia. But in order to do business in these places, you often had to deal with like warlords and royals and dictators. Oh, headache. However, my friends, in the City of London, anything is possible.
Only a marketplace, but one dealing in the trade of the world.
So the City of London was like, it became this specialist hub of bankers who just knew how to deal with them lot. They know all the laws, the customs. Barry, they don't handshake. No, they headbutt each other. So like, despite the official formal British Empire declining, the city and its shadowy network were formulating a plan to hold on to power forever. One day, right, in a smoke-filled room, a shady business deal was done. I don't know if it was like that, but that's how I picture it. A deal was made between the Bank of England and the top commercial banks, where they had made this loophole that transactions between two non-residents of Britain who were using foreign currencies were no longer bound by UK regulation. So despite all the deals, the transactions being done in London, legally, they were outside of British jurisdiction. What?
That's why they have the City of London. This seems really illegal. How do they get that approved? How'd they get around that?
60s, about 40% of international trade of British jurisdiction. By the 60s, about 40% of international trade was done in sterling. This loophole had birthed what would become known as offshore banking.
By the 1960s, 40% of international business was done through London. That's huge. Yeah, you know, I've heard that New York is the financial hub of the world, but then I always hear that it's actually London, and this is probably why.
It allowed money to flow freely, untouched and unfazed by boring, lame regulations. And it would go on to birth the euro-dollar market in 1955. The Cayman Islands sounds very relaxing, but there is nothing more relaxing than a good night's sleep. So I'm very happy to work with today's sponsor, Manta Sleep, and show off some of their amazing sleep masks. These masks basically give you complete blackout. So a lot of cheap, crappy masks that you're gonna get, I don't know, at an airport or something, you're gonna still be able to get a bit of light in there, but these are perfect. You'll get full blackout, breathable. You've got a bunch of, you put them on your arm of them, it has like a bloody December 1st, 5% off site, and use code JTG10 to get 10% off. Anyway, back to the video. Now, you see, the reason all this sort of banking trickery happened in the first place was in order to get around the Bretton Woods system. This was a system that imposed strict financial regulations and complete control over banks. This system was signed by 44 delegates from around the world, aka dorks. It was done in order to stabilize the economy from the endless financial crashes they kept going through. Crashes that are in large part responsible for the rise of communism and fascism that resulted in war and genocide. But let's be honest, really, the rules were just there so that the boys weren't allowed to have some fun.
Turnstile 24 forward 6 to dot. What's this man down to? 6 for an 8 sold. One more trades at 6. Pair off one there. What's that man down to?
The euro market ripped apart the Bretton Woods system. Suddenly, we now had a global market with no rules.
Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system of monetary management established the rules for commercial relations among the United States, Canada, Western European countries, and Australia, and other countries, a total of 44 countries. It was intended to govern monetary relations among independent states. The Bretton Woods system required countries to guarantee convertibility of their currencies into U.S. dollars to within 1% of fixed parity rates. With the dollar convertible to gold bullion for foreign governments and central banks, a US $35 per troy ounce of fine gold. It also envisioned greater cooperation among countries in order to prevent future competitive devaluations. Oh, so this regulated the price of gold and kept everybody using the dollar. And then in the 70s, they started going around it. Look at that. That's the price of gold. Here's the 70s. Here's now. Should have bought gold.
Suddenly, we now had a global market with no rules and no borders. And as you'd expect, the money came a-pouring in to the City of London. Governments around the world went into panic because they couldn't stop this overwhelming flow of cash into this unregulated, shadowy market. And you might be wondering, did they try and stop it? Did they do something? Or did they impose some sanctions? Maybe an embargo? No, it didn't do that. They all just kind of went, where do we sign up? The City of London had established a second British Empire.
There are occasions when things which are basically bad for the country could perhaps benefit the stock exchange, although not in the long term, but in the short term, sometimes things like inflation, which is bad obviously on the long term for the country, would actually help the price of shares go up.
This city has been the center of finance for 300 years. And it needs to be the center of finance for 300 more years.
These days, London is like the Zezima of finance. It does bounce around with New York and stuff, but pretty much they are the top of the...
What does that mean? What is Zezima? I don't get it. Zezima. Oh, RuneScape. I guess that's a video game? I don't know.
Zezima of finance. It does bounce around with New York and stuff, but pretty much they are the top of the leaderboards. And if we were to add in all of like the British tax havens that we own, Jersey, Guernsey, the Cayman Islands...
Yeah. Top 20 global financial centers: New York, London, Hong Kong, Singapore, San Francisco, Chicago, Los Angeles, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Frankfurt. Wow, Germany's way down there.
They are the top of the leaderboards. And if we were to add in all of like the British tax havens that we own, Jersey, Guernsey, the Cayman Islands, etc., roughly 1/3 of all finance is going through areas of the former British Empire that we still own. Despite the fact that from my research, these tax havens, they don't give us like a penny. We don't charge them. They literally just steal what would be tax money from us. And like, a small island with lots of money, lots of wealthy people would be a great target for like some pirates or something to go along and steal some money. And so we, from as far as I can tell, give them full NATO protection. Well, all I'm saying, we should probably invade the Cayman Islands. And on top of that, if you add up like ex-colonies, countries that are recently independent, like Singapore, then that figure would actually come to about 40% of all international finance. So whilst on paper, these transactions are 40%.
What really pricked my interest was simply looking at the data of international lending and deposits and where they are located. On the face of it, London is the largest international financial center, followed by New York. But this data tends to treat British jurisdictions like Jersey, Guernsey, the Cayman Islands, and so on as entirely separate, independent territories. They are not. They are part of the British state, and if you add them all together, you find that at the moment roughly 1/3 of all international deposits and investments are going through these jurisdictions, which are remnants of the British Empire and which remain part of the British state. And if you add ex-colonies whose independence was relatively recent, like Singapore, then you reach a figure of 40%. This compared to roughly 10% going through the US. So yeah, a lot of that money would be taxed, right, if it was going through London proper. But it's not being taxed.
% of all international finance. So whilst on paper, these transactions are often registered to places like the Cayman Islands, in reality, most of them are being agreed upon and done in London. But you see, whilst in the beginning this was all under the control of the loving British establishment, little to their knowledge, they had created a beast that they wouldn't be able to control forever.
Line on defense. By now, nobody in the country has any doubts about the toughness of their new Prime Minister. Nobody questions her determination to do what she says.
Margaret Thatcher. I know, sorry. We can't get a video without saying her fucking name. Right. She who must not be named was the main accelerator of the foreign financial invasion of Britain. In the 80s,
really?
She started off the process of privatization. A process of selling what were once state-owned utilities, businesses, and resources into the private market. Now, I don't really want to do the whole argument of whether privatization or nationalization, which one's better. Personally, I'm very much case case by case. Capitalism works really well in some industries, others not so much. I tend to land that if it's a natural monopoly like water and rail, or if it's vital to like national security or health, like the NHS or like nuclear power stations, I tend to think that that should be owned by the country. However, Margaret Thatcher and seemingly every other politician since doesn't agree with that premise.
In the 70s, almost half the nation were council tenants. Then came Margaret Thatcher's monumental change, giving tenants the right to buy their homes at big discounts.
In 1980, Thatcher passed the Right to Buy scheme, whereby council houses that were built and paid for by public tax money were sold off to private owners at an incredibly discounted rate. By 1986, 1 million people had purchased through this scheme. And like, yeah, there were some winners, some good things happened. Like Mickey and Suze were able to buy the house for themselves. It's great. But what happens when Mickey and Suze get into the later end of their life and they want to sell off the house and go move to Cyprus to enjoy their final days together in the sun? Well, these once council houses landed in the hands of people who were not Mickey and Suze. As we see here in this lovely graph, you'll see that the UK housing stock that has gone into private rental has soared in the last 30 years. An increasing amount of the owners of these private rental accommodations are private investment firms. The China Investment Corporation is estimated to own about £970 billion in British assets.
Holy crap. The properties are all ultimately owned via the China Investment Corporation, which manages the foreign exchange reserves of the People's Republic of China and is estimated to have more than £970 billion of assets. Wow.
Recently, the American private equity firm called Blackstone bought up to about 1,750 houses, agreeing to spend $1.4 billion on more than 4,500 homes in Britain. And that isn't just old properties, that is also new buildings that are being built to address the housing crisis.
New developments are increasingly being taken abroad before being put up for sale in London. One agent told us some developers now head straight to places like China and Singapore, meaning a whole block of flats could be sold overseas before it's even been built.
After the social housing Haygate estate was demolished and the rebuild of it happened, every single flat was sold to foreign investment. And these are just like case by cases. These are stories that happen constantly. The UK has not imposed any laws to stop this happening, to stop foreign companies buying up all of our housing and speculating on it, which has skyrocketed the cost of housing as our housing supply shrank and the demand has grown, and is very much partly responsible for the housing crisis. But look, mate, if killing off the middle...
Hang on. In 1956, you could buy a home in Britain for £1,891. In 1992, it was £50,000. Yo, I would have a house. Now it's up to £270,000. Wow.
But look, mate, if killing off the middle class isn't enough, and, you know, don't get me wrong, I don't love every Damien and Rupert, but, you know, it's bigger than that. London has been sold off on the cheap to oligarchs and autocrats who snap up properties all around London to hide away what is often dirty cash.
Yevgeny Chichvarkin has been attracted to a sport associated with the British upper classes.
Money gives you kind of freedom for some things.
Back in 2017, a study by the Trust for London found that in some luxury developments, up to 60% of apartments were sold to investors from high corruption risk countries, with just 10% going to UK buyers. So all of this is happening while 66,000 local people are stuck in like temporary accommodation, often in cold, damp, mold-infested room with fucking rats nibbling at your knees. I don't know about the rats, but I'm sure it's happened. All the while, there's about 36,000 long-term empty properties just sitting in London. In 2023, the Evening Standard, by the way, that's a paper here in Britain owned by Alexander Lebedev, a Russian oligarch and ex-KGB lieutenant colonel at the Soviet Union's London embassy. You know, we'll talk about him a bit more later. Even his own newspaper reported that 100,000 London homes were being held by overseas buyers. Often sovereign wealth funds from other countries, private equity, or just high net worth individuals. In fact, 40,000 residential properties are now owned by completely anonymous companies registered in secrecy in tax havens like the Virgin Islands.
London is a haven for Russian oligarchs.
Yeah, I should say, for starters, that it's not just a haven for Russian oligarchs, it's a haven for any oligarchs. You name them, we have them. Though your wealth is very secure here, it's protected by the British legal system, by the British police. It's not going to be investigated by the British legal system either. So it isn't just a great place to spend money, it's also a really great place to keep money, and you can keep it here forever.
Mate, toddle around Westminster or Kensington. This is like a super nice rich part of London. 10 to 13% of those properties are owned by overseas landlords. And this trend is starting to spread all across Britain, with over £80 billion worth of residential properties in the hands of overseas landlords. All right, so that's fucking housing done. But from the 80s onwards, Thatcher, Tony Blair, and basically everyone since turned Britain into like a fucking car boot sale, shotting off all of our valuable industries and utilities to private owners, often from foreign countries run by dictators and oligarchs and bad boys. Our water supply, you know, the stuff in the taps in our home, 70% of its ownership is in the hands of foreign investors, hidden behind offshore funds, private equity and sovereign wealth funds from nations like Qatar, China, and Australia. I mean, Australia's all right, but I mean, these companies, under the promise of improving the service, efficiency, investment, profitability, well, they've taken to recently sort of pumping piss and poo into our water. What? Just the lakes, the rivers. And this has resulted in making England's water amongst some of the most polluted in all of Europe.
I just learned that King Charles owns a pipe that leaks poop into the water, and he makes £300,000 a year from it. It doesn't fix it. Hospital admissions for waterborne diseases in England up 60%. Labour Party analysis of figures since 2010 shows raw sewage was discharged for more than 3.6 million hours last year.
For waterborne diseases have risen by 60%. And since the water was privatised in 1989, these water companies have managed to rack up a debt of £64 billion. And you might think, oh, well, maybe it's because of all the investments into the infrastructure and improving the water supply. No, it wasn't that. We have archaic infrastructure. They haven't fucking put anything into that. But what they did get done in that time was pay out £78 billion worth in dividends. All the while, they've had to raise our bills, the customers' bills, by 40%. Not to invest into infrastructure, but to pay off the debt that they've incurred. Meanwhile,
that's a cash grab, right? They're charging the customers more, the British citizens, more so they can pay their shareholders money before they even take care of the business, before they even do what they're selling, which is clean water. Thames Water has £23 billion of assets that are in urgent need of repair, and the supply of water to its 16 million customers is on a knife edge.
Well, it is believed that £23 billion worth of repairs are needed, all whilst these companies look like they're about to go bankrupt. And if/when they collapse, they're not going to get punished. We, the taxpayer, are going to end up bailing them out.
Right. And what have they done with that? Have they built any new reservoirs? No, not a single one. Have they maintained the infrastructure in such a way as there isn't sewage in the rivers and this? No, they haven't done anything of that. What they did, they dished it out as dividends. They shared it out amongst themselves.
Yeah. Wow.
They must think we're the stupidest people on earth.
And it's not just the water supply, man. It's fucking everything. Our energy distribution is owned by EDF, a French company. 60% of the national grid is now in the hands of an Australian investment group. We nearly allowed China to own our nuclear power. And I know what you're thinking. That sounds like a bad idea. An undemocratic superpower that doesn't really love us that much, owning our nuclear. But fear not, my friends, because the industry boss by the name of Tom Greatrex, he told us that it's not a security risk.
The UK government has designated Huawei as a high-risk vendor, but manageable. The Americans aren't convinced, and they aren't happy.
The UK did allow China with their company Huawei into the UK, and it was looking very likely that they were going to make/own our 5G network. This was even after security agencies said that this is not a fucking good idea.
London has become the dirty money capital of the world. We are not the ones saying this. Britain's very own Deputy Foreign Secretary has made a rare admission. He says nearly 40% of the world's dirty money goes through London.
It's not just that dirty money is eating away at democracy here in Britain.
It's also trashing our reputation abroad. It means that poor countries which used to look up to Britain now despise us because of our role in laundering the kleptocrats' cash.
By dirty money, we mean cash stolen from warlords and dictators and dodgy politicians.
What does that say? It's not just the courts helping out the corrupt and the criminal either. Dictators, gangsters, and other criminals like hiding their cash in our banks and property market too. A few years ago, we showed how NatWest Royal Bank of Scotland, UBS, and HSBC banked millions that had been paid in bribes to corrupt Nigerian state governors. One of those governors sunk some of his corrupt profits into our 4 luxurious houses in North London. The fact that this dirty money is stashed in London is not a side effect of the corruption that happens in Nigeria. It is what helps it to happen. It's not just a side effect of the corruption that happens. It is what helps it to happen.
By money, we mean cash stolen from warlords and dictators and dodgy politicians. Currently, Africa right now is bleeding cash. 88.6 billion a year.
That was a graphic of South America.
Currently, Africa right now is bleeding cash. 88.6 billion a year is being lost in capital flight. Meanwhile, in 2019, the entire continent only managed to pull in 45 billion in foreign investment. The Panama Papers and the Luanda leaks revealed how foreign investors, African elites, and corrupt regimes are stashing cash offshore, draining the continent dry. Kleptocrats in Angola, Congo, and Equatorial Guinea are the ones who are benefiting from these global money laundering networks.
All the talks about financing for development. So financing the SDGs has been estimated to cost about $200 billion annually, right? If Africa is bleeding out 86 billion of that, how on earth are we ever going to have the investment, to make the SDGs realizable?
And so instead of driving money locally into Africa to help improve it, build infrastructure, and fix some of their problems, massive amounts of wealth is just being siphoned out, completely destabilizing whole countries, forcing people to migrate and leave their homes. Research has actually found that for every 1% increase in corruption leads to an 11% rise in emigration, people leaving the country. This stuff.
Oh. By looking at 4 separate measures of corruption, the findings in this paper suggest that corruption indeed acts as both push and pull factors in migration decisions. Based on a gravity model, a 1-unit increase in the corruption level in the origin country is associated with an 11% increase in outmigration. So all this financial rigmarole is causing people to leave their poor countries.
In corruption leads to an 11% rise in emigration, people leaving the country. This stuff is having a major destabilizing effect on many of these nations and their people's lives.
Wow. Yo, I didn't know all this was going on. This is shady stuff.
But as the years went by, the influence of the East India Company grew, until by the mid-18th century, British merchants ruled most of India.
I think it's fascinating, this question. How on earth was it possible for a private company to take over the best part of India?
Now, boys, if we think back, right, to the East India Tea Company, it took a bit of time before the British took control of India. It was a slow process. And this slow process is what we can see here in Britain. Slowly selling off our nation, bit by bit, to foreign entities. It has started to bleed into our politics, creating laws that benefit the ultra-powerful, whilst absolutely shafting the people of this country. From political donations, lobbying, think tanks, close ties to law firms, they're benefiting from laxer and laxer rules and regulations.
Russian-born husband of Tory donor earned millions via oligarch connections. Vladimir Chernukin's wife, Lubov, has given conservatives more than £2 million. Blue-chip firms with Chinese interests pour cash into UK Parliament lobbying group. Y'all, lobbying should be illegal, right? Wealthy donors, including HSBC and the City of London Corporation, make the China APPG one of the best funded in Parliament. Revealed, the City of London's secret foreign policy shielded from democratic oversight. The obscure City of London Corporation has a foreign policy program which runs in conjunction with the Foreign Office, but details of it are protected from transparency laws because it is privately funded. It's not a secret anymore, right? Yo, this needs to be spread. You gotta share this video with people. It's kind of a boring financial issue, but it's Important.
Ties to law firms. They're benefiting from laxer and laxer rules and regulations, allowing their dirty money to flow freely. So all of this led us, right, to 2022, where the UK finally went, all right, fine, we'll do something. Fuck.
Okay.
And so the National Security Bill was proposed. A bill designed, to keep our nation secure. However, just conveniently, and I'm sure it's a coincidence, but the key part of the legislation, the plan to require that lobbyists, PR firms, and other professionals in the UK disclose whether they work with people like China and Russia, or any other foreign country for that matter, surprisingly, that bit that was expected to be in the bill wasn't there. And this bill has literally faced endless delays.
Plans to require lobbyists, PR firms, and other professionals in the UK to register their work for Russia, China, or any other foreign country have been unexpectedly left out of the National Security Bill published on Wednesday. That was the whole reason for this bill, and they left it out. Who left it out? Let's find that out. Put them in prison.
Being the bill wasn't there. And this bill has literally faced endless delays. The last I read about it was in August 2024, and it seems to be still delayed.
Russia is interfering, and it is doing so to try and undermine public confidence in political institutions and in the mainstream media in Western countries. And we have to regard the spread of fake news propagated by fake accounts across Twitter and Facebook in this way as a real threat to our democracy.
The Russians are doing that in America too, y'all. They're doing that here too.
In 2022, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury admitted that hundreds of billions are likely laundered through the UK each year, turning dirty cash into legit assets that just disappear into our economy. Now, you might be wondering, what are we doing to stop this?
Glaring outrages is the role played by what I call the pinstriped accomplices, the bankers and lawyers and accountants, who make a huge amount of money servicing the worst people in the world and basically managing their reputations, getting them into the financial system, and then suing anyone who tries to criticise them.
We have departments like the National Crime Agency, the Serious Fraud Office, and these departments are severely underfunded, and they are just completely outmatched to go against these big, powerful people. One of the best examples of this, to look at the failed case that the NCA brought against the daughter and grandson of Kazakhstan's former president, who allegedly, I have to say allegedly, funneled dirty money through UK property. Despite, there being a lot of evidence for this, their elite, well-funded legal team just completely wrecked the NCA. British law firms are literally weaponized by kleptocrats and criminals to stop investigations looking into their dealings.
In her 2020 book, Putin's People, author Catherine Belton wrote that Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich bought the Chelsea Football Club in 2003 on the orders of President Vladimir Putin to extend Russian influence abroad.
This mother.
Abramovich's lawyer told London's High Court that the book contained what he described as lazy inaccuracies. Russia's state-owned energy giant Rosneft is also suing Belton and her publisher HarperCollins UK.
In 2021, a libel lawsuit was brought against the publisher HarperCollins and the author and journalist Catherine Belton to suppress her book called Putin's People, which went into depth about the rise of Putin and the oligarchs that surround him. Despite the fact that the publishers did win this case that was brought by various Russian oligarchs against them, they were absolutely buried in legal costs of £1.5 million by using what is known as slaps, or a strategic lawsuit against public participation. The slaps.
HarperCollins said on Wednesday it had settled the dispute with Abramovich over certain passages in the first edition of Putin's People that contained some inaccurate information about him. It has now amended the text to record the position more accurately.
Did win this case that was brought by various Russian oligarchs against them. They were absolutely buried in legal costs of £1.5 million by using what is known as slaps, or a strategic lawsuit against public participation. The slaps thing, it's a funny name. It's basically this weapon that these very wealthy people can afford to use to make the lives of journalists absolute hell and massively dissuade anyone wanting to look into their dealings.
Press freedom advocates say the courts are being used to silence journalists.
Most of these stories will go unreported and unheard. How often do you hear about this stuff on mainstream media? Whilst every single day you're hearing about migrants on boats.
Right. Yep.
So I think you're kind of coming to the end.
It's the same in the US, y'all. Putin's doing the same. The immigration stuff, is it all just Russian propaganda?
Understanding that Russian influence over Britain is very strong. So strong that London has received the nickname Londongrad.
Today, there's so much Russian cash in Britain, the capital has been nicknamed Londongrad. British intelligence has warned that oligarchs' money is propping up Putin's regime and helping to fund the war in Ukraine.
After the fall of the Soviet Union, a bunch of sort of Adidas-wearing guys in flat caps started buying up all of the state's assets, creating this generation of extremely rich Russian oligarchs. And where better to clean your dirty money than London? And like, we didn't fight it, we just said, come on in, boys. Can I get you a cup of cocoa? The UK government, led by John Major, introduced what is known as a golden visa, where basically you could get British residency in exchange for investing in Britain, aka buying a fucking nice house in London with not a single background check required. By 2012, hundreds of these golden visas were given out to Russians and Chinese. The infamous Boris Johnson has a very cozy relationship with a geezer called Yevgeny Lebedev, the son of Alexander Lebedev, you know, the KGB, the bad guy we talked about before, who owns, on top of a number of different businesses, one of Russia's biggest banks. He owns the Evening Standard newspaper. Yeah, and there is definitely no conflict of interest there. Don't you worry about it, sunshine. Bojo didn't just, you know, bump into him every now and then. He was a bestie, and he would attend their infamous Italian bunga parties. Boza loved Yevgeny so much that he made him a baron. But it would be in 2018 when Boris was the foreign secretary, at the exact same time that the Kremlin decided to dead off a guy in Britain using a nerve agent. Right? It's pretty fucked.
2018, Russian double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter survived an attack with a Soviet-era nerve agent on British soil.
And the UK went, oh no, guys, what the fuck? I thought we would chill. Like, this was a major fucking deal. So the UK and NATO were trying to work out sanctions, expel Russian diplomats. But Boris Johnson jumped in and said, boys, leave it to me.
That you met with the former KGB officer Alexander Lebedev when you were Foreign Secretary without officials on the 28th of April 2018.
I would need to check.
You used to regularly meeting him? I mean, is it probably because you meet him often or probably because you can't remember?
I've met him on a very few occasions.
As Foreign Secretary?
On the occasion you're mentioning, if that was when I was Foreign Secretary, then yes.
And where did you meet him?
I met him in Italy, as it happens. But
Boris toddled off on his own to Italy, where he met with the former KGB officer Alexander Lebedev without any officials present, breaching all kinds of protocols. And to this day, there is no recorded report of what they said, what was discussed. Nothing. So like, look, with all this sort of Russian fuckery that was been happening in Britain, on the 21st of July 2020, the Intelligence and Security Committee released the Russia Report.
After months of delay, Parliament has finally been able to publish its report into allegations of Russian interference in British public life,
showing evidence that Russian interference in our economy and our politics is commonplace. On top of that, it showed that there was interference in the 2014 Scottish referendum on independence. According to the report, the British government have welcomed the Russian oligarchs and their money with open arms, providing them with a means of recycling illicit finance through the London laundromat and connections to the highest levels with access to UK companies and political figures. Like, this report showed the Russian interference. It was fucked. And there was one big question that sort of loomed over this whole thing, especially following the Internet Research Agency scandal where
Russia used hundreds of fake accounts to tweet about Brexit. In the US, Russia used hundreds of fake accounts to tweet about the election being stolen, the 2020 election, and immigrants invading.
400 fake Twitter profiles were created by the Kremlin trying to push Britain to leave the EU during Brexit. The question loomed of whether Russia bought Brexit.
There was reason to fear Russia might meddle in the biggest decision in decades, the EU referendum. But evidence of that, the government didn't seek and didn't find.
The UK government have actively avoided looking for evidence that Russia interfered. We were told that they hadn't seen any evidence, but that is meaningless if they hadn't looked for it.
Right.
The outrage isn't that there was interference. The outrage is that no one has wanted to know if there was interference. Successive governments have welcomed Russian oligarchs and their money with open arms, who are now very well integrated into both UK business, political and social scene.
Is it your belief that the government deliberately looked the other way?
I wouldn't want to say that the UK government deliberately avoided asking the questions, but nevertheless, they did avoid asking the questions.
They're doing the same thing to both of us, y'all. These Russians are trying to tear us apart.
Now, look, I'm talking all this stuff, and you might start getting a bit conspiratorial, but personally, I'm no David Icke. I don't believe there's some grand evil master plan. I really do just think that most governments, people like Thatcher, I just don't think they understood what they were letting unleash. Often it's just short-term decisions, like, wanting to get foreign investment to get things for cheap, and a real lack of foresight. The UK has just fucking sleptwalked its way into becoming like the bargain bin, and has just been selling off everything, slowly losing our sovereignty. Brexit ironically argued that it would bring us more sovereignty, and I wish that was true, but it hasn't done that, because it's forced us to double down on being like, a financial hub of the world. But as more foreign capital flows into this country, and more of our industries fall out of our hands, we lose sovereignty. Britain needs to make its economy work for its people, and not for shadowy billionaires living in the Cayman Islands.
Money is being leached from the railway to these private operators. They get paid whether the trains run or not. They've overseen a completely corroded regime on the railway where money is leached. They're subsidising private sector failure. We've got to see the new Labour government that's going to come in as an opportunity. Trade unions and community groups and others have got to push them as hard as we can to get our railways back in order, to get our bus services, schools, and we've got to deal with it if we want to get the country straight.
Wow. There was a headline back here. Union RMY says foreign government-owned companies will have a stake in 75% of UK's railways following New South West Trains franchise.
If you enjoyed that video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel.
I didn't enjoy
Jump
it.
on the Discord, we'll chat more about this.
Pissed me off.
I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.
Be sure to go to Jimmy the Giant, like and subscribe. This makes me so angry. I feel like the Russians are playing us all. And they've been playing us all for a long time. That's some evil evil. It makes me angry. Y'all share this video with your family and friends. Not my reaction, this guy's video. The Jimmy the Giant video. This is important. It's important. It's crazy because I feel like in America, there's this very anti-Russian perspective. But the people with the very strong anti-Russian perspective are at the same time the most susceptible to Russian propaganda. The baby boomers who fought in Vietnam, and they're very anti-Russian, anti-communist. But they're also the main targets of Russian propaganda. They don't understand, they don't even know that Russians have bots and fake accounts, and that the thing they're reading online is fake. They don't get it. They don't understand. They're not aware that they're being duped. They don't know. Probably a lot of times I didn't know I was being duped when the Russians are putting something in front of my face. I feel like it's the same in Britain. The older white dudes, who probably have the strongest patriotic sense, are being fooled into selling out their own country. It's so sad. And scary. Really scary. There's some f***ed up shit going on in Britain. In America too. But y'all, damn it. What are we gonna do? I feel like the people of Russia, the actual Russians, are actually just like the rest of us. They're cool. They're just like us. But it's the government. It's that motherfucker in office. It's causing all this crap. Y'all be sure to check out my other page, JJLA Reacts Music. I'd like to thank my patrons. I'd like to thank my Buy Me a Coffee folks. Be sure to go to Jimmy the Giant, like and subscribe. Thank y'all for watching this with me, and I'll see you next time. Later.